Hey, what's going on, guys? So Gothic 1 Remake just got a new update, and this is one of those patches that tells you a lot about where the game is right now. And the first thing people are going to notice is that this patch is coming after a pretty noisy launch window. Players were already calling out weird progression issues, achievements not registering the way they should, NPC behavior getting stuck, and basic control problems that make the whole thing feel less polished than it should. You also had reports of frame rate drops, random combat weirdness, and a few quest-related bugs that can really throw off the pace of the game. So when you look at the patch notes as a whole, it feels like the team is trying to put out fires in the places that matter most first, which is usually the right move when the game has just hit the public and people are still stress testing it in every direction. One of the fixes addresses achievements not popping properly, which is something achievement hunters were definitely not happy about. It might sound minor if you do not care about completion tracking, but for players who spend dozens of hours chasing every objective and unlock, seeing progress fail to register can be incredibly frustrating. Getting that sorted out is a pretty important quality of life improvement. There are also fixes for a strange issue involving two diggers that continue following players after a certain quest. If you ran into that bug, you know how bizarre it looked. NPCs are supposed to react to events and then move on with their routines, so having characters permanently attached to your adventure can break immersion pretty quickly. It is one of those problems that sounds funny until it starts interfering with gameplay. Another notable fix targets Mordreg. Some players reported that he simply was not where he was supposed to be, which can create obvious problems when quests depend on finding specific characters. Missing NPCs have a way of making players think they missed something important or did something wrong, when in reality the game itself is not behaving correctly. Fixing that should help prevent unnecessary confusion during progression. Kirgo is also getting attention in this update. There were reports of him not fighting the player when he was supposed to, which can completely change how certain encounters play out. In a game where character interactions and combat scenarios are such a major part of the experience, something like that can make a quest feel unfinished or broken. It is another example of the team going after issues that directly affect gameplay rather than focusing only on cosmetic fixes. Performance improvements are part of the update as well. Frame rate drops have been one of the more common complaints since launch, and while this patch is not going to solve every performance problem overnight, any improvement in consistency is going to be welcomed by players. A game can have great atmosphere and strong world building, but if performance becomes distracting, it starts pulling people out of the experience. The developers also addressed situations where controls were not responding as intended. Those kinds of issues can be especially annoying because they affect the basic connection between the player and the game. Whether you are exploring, fighting, or interacting with characters, unreliable controls can make everything feel less responsive than it should. Fixing those problems is important because it impacts nearly every part of the experience. And even with all of those changes, it sounds like there is still plenty left on the team's list. The developers themselves have acknowledged that the issues mentioned so far are only part of what players have been reporting. That is probably not surprising considering the size and complexity of a game like this, especially during the first weeks after release. On the console side, the conversation has been especially intense. The developers said they are aware of performance complaints on PS5 and PS5 Pro, and they made it pretty clear that this is not the kind of thing they can magically solve overnight. They said improvements will take time, which is never the sentence players want to hear, but at least it is a direct acknowledgement instead of radio silence. There is also the more serious issue of save deletion after crashes on PlayStation, and that one sounds like a nightmare if you've actually lost hours to it. The team called it highly critical and said a fix will go out as soon as they have a solution. So when you put all of that together, this update starts to look less like a tiny cleanup and more like the beginning of a longer repair job. PC players are getting attention too because the developers said they had seen crash reports there as well and were already planning fixes. That part lines up with what a lot of players have been talking about since launch because the game clearly has plenty of people enjoying it, but there are also enough technical rough spots that you cannot just ignore them. The lockpicking conversation is another big one. The team said the feedback is mixed, and their point is that the mechanic becomes much easier once you put skill points into it. That is probably true, but it also shows how the remake is walking a line between staying true to Gothic's old-school personality and making sure the systems do not feel like they are fighting the player. If a mechanic is confusing enough that half the community is arguing about it, then it is probably going to need another look sooner rather than later. What I think stands out most here is that this update feels like the developers are still figuring out where the biggest pain points are, while also trying not to overpromise. That usually earns more trust than pretending everything is fine when it obviously is not. If you are the kind of player who loves Gothic because it is rough around the edges and stubborn about its identity, you will probably see this patch as a good sign, because the core experience is still there, and the team is working to smooth out the bad surprises. If you are coming at it from the other side, especially on console, this is probably the kind of update that makes you watch closely and decide whether the game is getting healthier fast enough for you to jump back in. Either way, the message from the developers is pretty clear. They know the problems are there, they are not brushing them off, and they are already moving on fixes where they can.